I mean, I think that's where I start to look on the bleaker side and I start to be less reassured by this idea that Trump personally might not have a long-term plan here, but people around him do, and they have been preparing for this, and they are testing the limits and the legality of what they can do.
This is Rhyming Chaos, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great upheaval, tyranny, or authoritarian takeover. We hope these interviews can help us understand what is happening in the United States right now and how decent people can fight against it.
Today, we're really happy to be speaking to Katie Stallard, Senior Editor, China and Global Affairs at the new Statesman and the author of Dancing on Bones, History and Power in China, Russia, and North Korea, which was named Political Book of the Year 2022 by the Financial Times, Sunday Times, and BBC History magazine. She was previously based in Russia and China as a foreign correspondent for Sky News, and she has reported from more than 20 countries on awful things like conflicts, natural disasters, and highly repressive regimes. Welcome to Rhyming Chaos, Katie.
Thank you so much. It's good to be with you. I wish I could say that hasn't prepared me to report on the United States, but that wouldn't be true.
But it does make you the perfect guest for us. So in your book, Dancing on Bones, you write about how the political regimes in Russia, China, and North Korea have used history to stir up domestic nationalism. And an important part of the book examines the evolution of these states' narratives around World War II and the Korean War. How and why did World War II and the Korean War become the focal point of your book?
Let me start by saying, just at the outset, I am but a humble journalist, not a real scholar or a historian. So I come to this very much through practice, through what I've found on the ground and through my own reporting experiences and a kind of curiosity to understand what was behind this. So specifically the interest in World War II history and how that was being used in these three nations goes back to when I was first based in Russia, where I started out, I think, in early 2013. And my experiences during the first part of the Russian, I guess we can say the early part of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So this was the annexation of Crimea in 2014, and then the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And I was really struck moving backwards and forwards on both sides of the front line, as was then possible, how you would seem to move between these two almost parallel realities. On the Ukrainian side of the line, it was clear what people were fighting for, that they felt their country was under attack and that they were very clearly defending themselves against this assault from Russia. But on the pro-Russian sides of the lines and in Russia itself, you would hear all these references to Russian history, Soviet history, and specifically World War II, or as it's known there, the Great Patriotic War. And people were really buying into this idea of, now as then, fascism is on the rise in Europe, that this supposed junta has taken power in Kiev, that the forces of Nazism are once again on Russia's border, and we are here heroically fighting back and defending our people and their lives. And you would see all sorts of imagery there. So like at the rebel checkpoints in eastern Ukraine, one way you could tell from a distance who was manning it would be they would have the St. George's ribbon, this orange and black ribbon that has come to stand for the Russian victory in the Great Patriotic War. You would see posters of Stalin. And as I say, you'd hear these sort of explicit references to the great heroic history of the past and how that was now manifesting again. So I was really interested in how the version of history that you learn and the version of history that is being promoted in the media, in political statements, the way these conflicts are being framed could really shape how you experience these events. And then I moved from Russia to China in 2015, where one of my first assignments was the first Victory Day parade to commemorate then the 70th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, a decade ago from the one that we've just witnessed now, and really felt there were very strong parallels and echoes of the same argument then, that the current leadership was really appealing explicitly to this quite idealized, highly selective memory of the past as the reason that they should be in power today, the reason they need to build up their military strength in the current day and the reason that they need, strong leaders like Putin and Xi Jinping. And finally, and I realized this is a very long answer, so I'd started really researching these historical narratives in Russia and China, but then I was also from China reporting on North Korea, and I got the chance to go to North Korea a couple of times as a journalist and was really struck there by just how present the history, particularly in that case of the Korean War, but also to some extent, at least their version of how the Second World War ends, is really present in the Kim regime's current narratives. So that sort of started then this process and this interest in trying to figure out, how did we get to this point? What are the stories that are being told in these countries and how do they relate directly to the politics of the present day?
World War II still gets invoked by the regimes you have studied as highly symbolic and galvanizing event. Xi Jinping just hosted a huge parade to celebrate the end of World War II. We're recording on September 3rd, and Putin is one of the honored guests. Putin, of course, still holds similar parades in Russia every May. Why do these leaders continue to invoke this war so strongly and devote so many resources to such historic spectacles?
Yeah, it was really striking to see Kim Jong-un there front and center too, alongside Xi and Putin at that parade in Beijing. I mean, partly I think it's because it's tremendously effective. These military parades, there are a few things at the same time. I think, number one, they're a demonstration of, here is what we are doing for the country. I think we can tend to confuse from the outside sometimes, particularly in these very autocratic regimes, this idea that these leaders are just in power through repression. It's, jackboots, firm control, propaganda, and goose-stepping troops going past in these big parades. But I think there's a much more complicated and much more nuanced picture when you actually spend time on the ground in these countries. And there is continuous, really deep effort towards domestic legitimacy and propagating this idea for why, in the case of China, the Communist Party needs to be in power. What happened to the country before the Communist Party was in power and how it has ended the century of humiliation and built this strong, proud, modern nation. So I think, in simple terms, these great military parades that you see in Beijing last night, but also in Moscow, also in Pyongyang, are a way of showing we are a modern nation with a modern military. We're a strong nation, and we have built up the power to defend ourselves, to defend our citizens from all these foreign threats that people are continually told are gathering at the gates. So it's a display of raw power. It's a display of the leaders being in command. So when you see Xi Jinping inspecting the ranks through the sunroof of the red flag limousine and being saluted by all of the troops and everybody answering in unison, it's a pretty basic, raw display of power. It's showing he's in control. He can command complete respect and loyalty. And anybody who's thinking of challenging him should think again. And I think that that's the final thread of this and what I think is important, because it's not necessarily the case that everyone who takes part in these parades or who watches them necessarily believes in the message and believes what they're saying and is genuinely personally committed to Xi Jinping. But equally, nobody watching knows what people really think. So if you are thinking, I personally disapprove of this regime, I would like to take actions to protest it, it's telling you you are a tiny minority, you're powerless. There aren't many people who think like you. So it's a sort of way of showing how much power, how much control, how much dominance the current leaders really have. So I think a lot of it is symbolism, but there's important substance behind that too.
So it sounds like, Katie, like there's kind of a signaling of conformity to the public, but also signaling to potential contenders within elites that you have no chance to contend this particular leader. So it's kind of like dual audience, but also global audience, right? Signal to external publics and leaders that China, in this case, is very strong and militarily capable to resist any potential influence of the United States, for instance.
Right. And also that Xi Jinping is very strong and Vladimir Putin is very strong and is genuinely popular. It's one of the reasons that you see, continued rituals of holding elections in countries like Russia. It's showing, apart from anything else, to the selectorate, to the people in the higher ranks who might be thinking about their own future beyond this leader, and how long is he going to go on, and what will it mean if he fades from power, and should they be getting behind somebody else. I think these raw displays of I am large and in charge and I'm genuinely popular and I'm the person who commands the respect of the military is a signal that don't think about challenging me, and that also that, your interests are secure. You don't need to think about who you're going to get behind in a couple of years' time, because I'm going to go on. I'm going to be in this position for a very long time. I mean, potentially a very, very long time if you listen to the hot mic comments of Putin and Xi entering the parade last night and talking about the potential of living to 150 years.
Katie, I heard that, but perhaps you could explain what happened.
So in probably the best piece of raw audio ever captured, Putin and Xi Jinping are strolling towards the gate of heavenly peace, discussing the prospects of living for a very long time and whether the technology now exists to transplant various organs such that you can basically live. I think they were suggesting you might be able to go on indefinitely. And Xi Jinping then says that he's heard that somebody born in this century could expect to live to 150. So they were certainly talking about being in your 70s as, you're just a youngster.
A spring chicken.
Just getting started.
Yeah, just getting started. So they sounded like men who are planning to be in power for a pretty long time.
I think so. And of course, Xi Jinping has that hospital in Beijing dedicated to keeping the leaders alive for as long as possible. So he knows of what he talks, probably, anyhow. Our own dear leader here in the United States also enjoys parades quite a bit. You've written about Trump's lust for parades being inspired by, when he saw the Bastille Day celebrations in Paris. But you've also written that he is learning from other strongmen. Do you think this type of parade, there's something about the spectacle itself that strongly appeals to autocratic leaders? And do you think Trump's parade, the previous one, apparently he's going to have another one, do you think it was successful in spiking his popularity or cementing his authority?
So I went to that parade in June in DC with a friend who was also previously based in Beijing. And I think we were both very unsure what to expect and what form it might take. And it felt at the time, this was when active duty Marines were on the streets in LA, the National Guard had been called up. I think we were pretty concerned that we were going to see this very militaristic and quite similar to what we had both seen in Beijing or in places like Moscow. And the good news for everyone who's concerned about the apparent descent into authoritarianism is it was absolutely dismal. It was really kind of shambling, and it felt like a historical pageant. The army were marching past, not in the sort of lockstep precision drills that you see in Beijing and Moscow, but just sort of walking past the spectators. There were long, inexplicable gaps between the various contingents. People around us were sort of asking each other, is that it? Do you think it's over now? And then there would be a shout go up, no, I see more coming, or I see a tank. So it felt very unimpressive. It felt very undisciplined. I mean, it was just a bizarre spectacle. You had these, thanks to Coinbase and Phantom Energy Drink who were sponsoring it. So it didn't feel like the sort of serious display of raw military power that perhaps Trump was hoping for. But he clearly is beguiled by the kind of spectacles that you see in Beijing and Moscow. He was clearly watching the parade last night because he was posting on Truth Social about it and saying that, they should give more credit to Americans for their contribution to that war. And I think he is drawn, this continuous speculation about why is he so keen to see the best in Vladimir Putin? Why is he rolling out the literal red carpet in Alaska and applauding him and continually trying to see absolutely the best motivation in his assault on Ukraine? And I think, honestly, the simplest answer is not that there's some high-level compromise. It's that he's the type of leader he would like to be. He thinks that he is one of very few real peers that he has in the world, that Russia and China are both great powers, great nuclear powers, and he sees himself amongst their ranks. So yes, the last military parade was perhaps not what he was expecting, but I think his instincts do seem to lie in that direction.
Perhaps we'll be saved a similar spectacle in Washington, D.C. by the inability of the American military to learn to goose step.
Just haven't tackled the skills yet. In the second part of your book, you examine domestic factors pushing for a reinvention of history in official discourses in China, Russia, and North Korea. In China, for instance, the post-Tiananmen crisis has led the leaders to remake historical narratives. And in Russia, the collapse of the Soviet Union was a decisive critical crisis moment for the leaders. Why do some major events create such high-level historical reckoning? And can you say more about why some crises become so decisive? What makes the particular events you studied stand out?
So there was to my mind, really significant event 5 days after the Tiananmen crackdown that you will both be familiar with, as I'm sure will your listeners, where Deng Xiaoping addresses officers at the general rank and above on the 9th of June. And he's very clear in that speech on where he thinks they've gone wrong. He says our greatest mistake in the last 10 years was in the field of education, that we didn't do enough to tell the people, and he means regular people all over the country, what kind of a country China was before, what life was like, essentially how hard life was in China before the Communist Party came to power. And you then see this massive effort in the following decades, starting in the early 1990s with this nationwide patriotic education campaign, to really focus on China's humiliation, this idea that China had been victimized over centuries, specifically, again, as you will well know, this idea of the century of humiliation that begins with the Opium Wars of the 19th century, when China is carved up and torn apart by these imperialist foreign powers, the final act of which in this narrative is the Japanese invasion of China at the start of the Second World War. So there is this real effort to focus on how China has been victimized, how Chinese people have suffered, and then the Chinese Communist Party's role in supposedly wiping away that humiliation and rallying the Chinese people to stand up. And I think you see Xi Jinping come to power in late 2012 with a similar diagnosis of what is going wrong, with this sense that China is sort of drifting, a lot of the cadres are becoming corrupt, that people are coming to expect these double-digit rates of annual growth, that people have lost sight of what China had been through in the past. This sense of, young Chinese today need to learn to eat bitterness, like they need to understand what suffering was involved in creating the modern, strong China in which they live. So he has a couple of speeches in late 2012 where he talks about how the collapse of the Soviet Union, in his mind, one of the primary causes were these attacks on ideology, and specifically this sense of historical nihilism, that there was a denial of Soviet history, denial of Lenin, denial of Stalin, and that nobody was a real man, is the way he puts it. Nobody came forward to defend the Soviet Union and what it had stood for. So he then initiates this great campaign in China against historical nihilism, as it's called, which continues to this day, with essentially this idea that we need to really focus on safeguarding and controlling China's history, that it's a really powerful resource. And if we allow it to be torn down, if we allow the pillars of our legitimacy and the Communist Party's history to be destroyed, then we similarly could find ourselves in a state of collapse. And I think it is really significant that both Xi and Putin lived through and experienced powerfully the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that both men have experiences in their own early lives of the world turning upside down, personally losing power, finding themselves on the wrong side of a mob in the streets. So I think both men have really front and centered this idea that you have to keep firm control of history, that if you lose control of ideological work and you lose control of the story of the past, then that's a real threat in the present. So I think they see this not as a sort of abstract academic concern, but as something that really directly concerns their own regime security and the future of the country.
How do authoritarians remake the narratives? Is there a playbook? Does it start at the top with an idea in their leader's head, or do they employ think tanks to do it? And how do they disseminate these ideas and ensure that school children and working adults all have to at some point listen to them?
Sometimes there is a clear top-down directive. Like in China in 2017, when I was living there, there was a directive one January day from the Education Ministry that the Second World War, or as it's known there, the Chinese People's War of Resistance against Japanese aggression and World Anti-Fascist War, was henceforth not to be known as an 8-year war of resistance, but it would be 6 years longer. It would now be the 14-year war of resistance. And where previously it had been said to start in 1937 with the attack on the Marco Polo Bridge on the outskirts of Beijing, now it would officially start in 1931 with the attack in September in Shenyang. So that was a clear directive that I spoke to teachers who received that and from then on planned their class lessons around the idea of this 14-year war of resistance. I also spoke to one of the curators of the War Museum in Beijing, actually alongside the Marco Polo Bridge, about what had happened and how that had affected his collection. And he was pretty clear that, from then on, yes, they did change some of the wording and they were clear to emphasize the fact that it was now 14 years. But beneath that, sort of one layer down, there was a long-running, genuine historical debate among scholars about whether it should be an 8-year or a 14-year war. So this wasn't something that was sort of plucked out of thin air and then imposed. It was more that the government essentially picked a side and said, here is how we will now interpret that history, and people have to make their adjustments accordingly. There are also, I think you see some cross-pollination between Russia and China in terms of laws. So you see in Russia in 2014, this new law go into effect against the rehabilitation of Nazism, which on the face of it is quite inoffensive. Who isn't against measures to prevent the rehabilitation of Nazism, but also meant that you then could not question the conduct of the Soviet military during the war. You couldn't contradict the findings of the Nuremberg Tribunal. And so it basically became hard, and in some cases illegal, to challenge the official narrative of the war. And people were prosecuted for posting, for instance, about the fact that the Soviet Union and Germany had jointly gone into Poland in 1939. That was now held to be against this law. And 4 years later in China, you see this new law to prevent, I think it was against the smearing of martyrs and heroes.
Historical nihilism.
Yes, it was illegal to defame somebody who was said to be a national martyr or hero. And again, there were prosecutions. People went to court who were perceived to have challenged these official narratives and heroes. So there is a degree of legal enforcement, there's a degree of top-down directive, but then I think there's just a huge degree of interpretation under that. And I think speaking to scholars in Beijing at the time about how they understood where the line was and what they could and couldn't publish, occasionally there would be explicit, clear red lines, but for the most part, it was more a sense of, I understand that this will be sensitive, and therefore I'll direct my research in a different direction, or I'll perhaps just elide this topic that might be troublesome. There's a lot of sort of just sussing out and deciding for yourselves, where is the line? What could get me into trouble? I think the best explanation of this that I drew on in the writing of the book was Perry Link's famous essay on the anaconda in the chandelier. And I think that's unfortunately...
Perhaps you could explain that metaphor, Katie.
Yeah, so unfortunately, it's also pretty relevant in the current day here in the United States. But Perry Link's idea was that instead of the boundaries of public debate being clearly enforced and policed, that the approach to censorship was more like this giant anaconda that sits in the chandelier and for the most part doesn't even move. But the fact that it's up there affects everybody who's in its shadow, who make their own large or small adjustments in its presence. So I think that's the best metaphor for how this system works, is sometimes there are clear directives and initiatives, but there's also an awful lot of deciding for yourself. Here are where the boundaries lie, and here is where it will be safer to go, and here is what might attract the attention of the anaconda in the chandelier.
You talk about how good propaganda always has an element of truth in it. And it strikes me when you mention in Russia the idea that you're not allowed to rehabilitate the Nazis. I mean, as you say, that sounds like a good thing. Does that remind you at all of the attacks on American universities under the guise of stopping anti-Semitism? And I know this is a very fiery topic, but
Right.
we are speaking to two Jews, so I think you can relax.
So my continual problem with this, and I go back and forth on this on a daily basis of trying to calibrate how alarmed to be, is that I think, when you're someone who's lived and worked in China and Russia and focuses a lot on how autocrats use history, that's what you see everywhere. So when I see President Trump talking about, the need to, it sounds to me like a version of the directive Xi Jinping had of the need to tell China's story well. And this idea that it's only people who hate their country or who are traitors or somehow enthralled to foreign ideas and dangerous ideology that would want to dwell on these dark aspects of the past. So under the guise of doing something that sounds noble and defensible and something we can all get behind, like tackling anti-Semitism, you can put a lot of people on the wrong side of that. And I think what's dangerous about it is this idea that, and it's also, frankly, offensively patronizing, that the government should decide for us, for American citizens, like what we can and can't deal with hearing. So this idea that we shouldn't focus so much on the terrible things that have happened in the past. And I think in Trump's words, how horrible the country is and how bad slavery was, that we somehow need to be sort of cosseted from that and prevented instead with this glorious, unifying, heroic version of history. I mean, it's very patronizing. I think fundamentally the lesson from these authoritarian regimes is that history shouldn't be something that is, there's a phrase in, I think, the Brezhnev era in Russia of the comfort blanket of memory, of giving people something that they can all feel good about and an event that people can agree on and rally around. That isn't how history should function in a democratic society. It shouldn't be something that, like a novel or a movie that makes us feel good about ourselves. It should be something that we can learn from and interpret critically and challenge. So it's long answer to the question of how this looks here, but honestly, very, very disturbing. I didn't think that I would be seeing a patriotic education campaign
in this country
rolled out in the United States. So it's kind of shocking to move here from China and see these kind of initiatives to interpret history in a more positive light now going into effect.
It's interesting when you talked about the patronizing element of this, kind of protecting people's feelings. Somehow I thought about, living in China when you often hear the phrase, it's all about your safety, like 为了你的安全. It's kind of like, it's all for you, like we're just kind of protecting you. Again, this very patronizing messaging that's either safety security-wise or safety emotionally. It's coming from the top down. But you were talking about history, right, getting rewritten here in America and the disturbing patterns you're observing. Of course, you're living in Washington, D.C., or you mentioned outside of D.C. in Maryland, and you get a front seat at these developments. How are you making sense of the Trump administration's attacks on museums and the nation's capital, but also how things should be taught at universities beyond, anti-Semitism? There's a huge array of intervention from local level to national level. For instance, in my state of Georgia, where I'm currently based, our Board of Regents just told us we have to upload our syllabi and make them publicly visible for scrutiny. And if Xi and Putin and Kim use history to justify their continued hold on power, what exactly is the Trump historical project? And is there more to simply making America feel great again for conservative straight white men, or is it something much more grandiose? Like, what do you see it as you're observing this fascinating and disturbing developments here in the U.S.?
I mean, again, I think the thing I struggle with is to what extent is there a grand scheme and an actual plan here, and to what extent is it just improvised around what plays well politically? And I think there are probably people in the administration who do have a coherent and disturbing and long-term view of where they would like this to end up. But I'm not necessarily convinced that Trump is one of them. So I think he is very interested in how this plays for him. He's very focused on the 250th anniversary of founding of the United States next year. And I think he envisages himself at the head of perhaps a military parade, but certainly a vast celebration of the country's history. And he doesn't want to hear about the complicating factors and the darker aspects of that history. The problem is that firstly, it's approaching history as a form of aggrandizement. So it works for the people and the systems of power that are in place at the current day. This sort of sense of historical determinism of marching on from one great victory to the next great victory in a, great glorious line of progress. But it also then fails to tackle any of the real legacies of that history. So just declining to talk about slavery or, editing out of the Smithsonian exhibits anything that Trump might find to be troubling doesn't make these things not have happened and doesn't mean they don't have ramifications in the current day. So I think it's a sort of double bind where it helps to entrench a current system of power and it plays well for Trump politically, but it doesn't do anything to tackle any of these longer running pathologies and actually serve the country and its interest beyond the current administration. So I think that's one of the strengths that we have in a democratic system is to think critically and challenge each other and have debates about how to think about history and the parallels in the present day. And I think if we give that up, it's just sort of voluntarily tying a hand behind our back. So I think I can see that why the politics of it would appeal to Donald Trump, but I don't think it is a campaign that serves the interests of the rest of us.
What do you think the role of Project 2025 has been in this attempt to, reshape narratives about American history?
I mean, I think that's where I start to look on the bleaker side and I start to be less reassured by this idea that Trump personally might not have a long-term plan here, but people around him do, and they have been preparing for this, and they are testing the limits and the legality of what they can do. And I think there is a broader sense that goes through Project 2025, but you also hear from people like the Vice President, J.D. Vance, that there is this sense that the culture and higher education and historical scholarship has sort of somehow been captured by the left. And so what they're doing is merely rewriting a wrong and injecting balance. So things have to be torn down to some extent to get back to a place that is equitable and fair. But I think if your solution to that and in feeling that your voices are not the ones being heard is to strong arm institutions, is to fire directors of museums, is to rewrite displays in the Smithsonian, it seems to be driven from a place of grievance rather than a well thought out plan to include more voices in that debate. So I think the Project 2025 side of this is quite troubling because it does suggest that there's a body of work and there's a lot of people who have done a lot of thinking about what to do with this moment and how it might continue beyond Trump. So that, I think, strengthens the argument that this isn't a sort of temporary vanity project that will come and go, but this is actually quite a long-term effort driven by prominent voices and thinkers on the right who really have a very different vision of how higher education, scholarship, and history, what is its role and what is its function in the current day.
I think you were actually quite generous to them just now in kind of saying that, well, maybe, there is a genuine case for kind of rebalancing history. I mean, there might be, but I don't think they care about that. I mean, this is a government full of anti-Semites claiming to clamp down on anti-Semitism. It's just one example of the cynicism, right? Yeah,
I think that's probably my inner journalist kicking in, where I'm always loath to say what I really think and always keen to have this sort of form of thinking of what is the best case interpretation of the argument on the other side of this and how can you define those arguments. So no, I mean, I think if I'm being honest, this isn't about wanting to broaden the debate and make sure more voices and perspectives are included. This is about very clearly rolling back any sense of acknowledging issues like institutional racism. I mean, you see it in the renaming of bases with Confederate generals. I guess I'm being overly probably diplomatic and generous about trying to understand what's driving that and what is the best faith way to put the argument on that side.
So shifting towards a more optimistic theme of dissent towards these nationalistic movements, in the book you talk about some resistance to official directives. In Russia, for instance, you introduced the director of Russia's state archives, Sergei Mironenko, who released a 1948 original investigation into a wartime story that inspired a blockbuster Panfilov 28 and showed that the story was based on an account of an individual journalist. But this director ended up losing his job, right?
Yeah, so this was the backstory for anyone who wasn't following it. The story of Panfilov's men, Panfilov's 28, is the story of these 28 riflemen who were fighting on the outskirts of Moscow in 1941. It became a very famous tale that was told to everybody. Every Soviet schoolchild knew it. They were outnumbered, outgunned, facing down these ferocious German tanks. They fired their last rounds. They used their last grenades and Molotov cocktails. And the leader of the group stands up and says, Russia is vast, but there is nowhere to retreat, for behind us is Moscow. So effectively, we have to make this last desperate stand. They somehow succeed in stalling the German advance. And then one of them is able to recount this story with his dying breaths. In 1948, there was then an investigation into the origins of this story, which was found to have been complete fiction. It was a correspondent for Krasnaya Zvezda, the Red Star newspaper, who had been dispatched to find stories that would boost morale, who took the names of genuine people who had been fighting in this battle, and then just let his imagination run wild. But that report saying that this was pure fantasy was kept secret until the archives opened in the early 1990s. This becomes relevant in 2015 because there is a new blockbuster version of the story of Panfilov's men, which is backed by the Russian Ministry of Culture. So as the story is now back in the news and, Panfilov's men have a giant monument built to them, streets have been named after them, they're really like national heroes. The director of the Russian archives posts the original 1948 report on the website just to say, look, for people who are interested in the real history here, this is what happened. And this story was a fiction and became the subject of a really fierce attack. So the then Minister of Culture, Vladimir Medinsky, who incidentally has since popped up at the head often of the Russian delegation in talks with Ukraine, he went after Mironenko, saying that this was slander, and that even if the story had been made up from start to finish, it was too valuable as a national myth. So Mironenko was a traitor. He should be sent back to the trenches with just a Molotov cocktail to defend himself. And he was removed from his post. But they went further. His boss was summoned for a personal meeting with Putin in the Kremlin. The archives were brought under more direct supervision. And the film received massive publicity. It was very popular. It did very well. And Vladimir Putin was photographed enjoying a personal screening. So the message from the state was pretty clear of we're not going to tolerate attacks on our history. So even if this isn't true, it's too valuable, it's too important a national story to challenge. So what Mironenko did was very courageous. He spoke about the importance in his job of telling the truth and being clear about facts. But he lost his job and he suffered personally because of it.
What about other dissident historians in the countries you've studied? Are there any examples that particularly stood out to you in your research?
There's actually a very strong parallel in China with this historian named Hong Zhengquai, who I don't know whether either of you might be familiar with. So there was a similar mythologized story also in 1941 of what are known as the 5 heroes of Lanyashan, the 5 heroes of Wolf Teeth Mountain, who supposedly volunteered to lead the Japanese army on this diversionary maneuver up into the mountains. This is in Hebei province, allowing the main body of Chinese troops to escape. So they managed to draw the Japanese troops away. They very similarly, fire every bullet that they have. Ultimately, they're throwing rocks at the Japanese soldiers to try and hold them off. And then, when they're out of any form of ammunition, they break their rifles so they won't fall into the hands of the enemy. And they throw themselves from a cliff, shouting, "Down with Japanese imperialism, long live the Communist Party," which this historian, Hong Zhongkwai, who lives in Beijing, decided he would investigate and try to find whether there was evidence of where and whether this had actually happened, whether there was anything in the Japanese archives, for instance, that might support this idea, and published an article, this was 2012 or 2013, in the journal Yanhuang Chunche, long-running, I guess we could say liberal journal, which has since unfortunately been taken over, but really laying out, here are the discrepancies I found in this tale. Here is where my historical scholarship has led me, and here are the questions that I think we need to be asking about this tale. He similarly then was attacked, firstly by leftists, and then ultimately he found himself in court and was found to have defamed revolutionary heroes and ordered to apologize. When I met him in 2018, he had lost his job. He was effectively unable to publish within China. He said he could only really publish now on foreign platforms. And he was also having all sorts of trouble just doing things like buying train tickets, for instance, because he would find himself periodically blacklisted or not able to travel. But he was similarly very clear. He's a very soft-spoken, mild-mannered, unassuming guy, I guess then in his early 40s, who simply felt it was his responsibility. He considered himself an intellectual in a long history of scholars and intellectuals, that he had a duty to tell the truth and to be clear about where his research had led him, even though it had led to these really pretty dire personal consequences.
I wonder if that's a warning for the United States. Do you think we're seeing anything like such dissident historians in the US yet? Or are there any particular initiatives that we should be following? People who are trying to counteract the regime's rewriting of history?
Well, I will tell you one story which fills me with optimism in this otherwise fairly bleak time, which is an initiative by a scholar at Georgetown University who put out an appeal for volunteer citizen historians who would go and document the current exhibits at the various Smithsonian institutions that have been targeted, and would do it in a way that is consistent with the latest best practices on preserving records. So it would basically create, at a rapid pace, a record of exactly what do all these displays currently say, what is the text, what is the imagery, what are the films that are being shown, what is the current status, so that it will then be possible to compare and contrast any changes that have been made. And it has been so popular that he has been inundated with volunteers. So last weekend, the Labor Day weekend, he put out an appeal late afternoon on the Friday saying, we urgently need people to go to the Holocaust Memorial because there is an exhibit there on Americans and the Holocaust, which is now due to close for a, quote, upgrade. We're concerned about what changes could be made. It's closing on Monday. We need volunteers to get there in the next couple of days and make a record. And he sent another email pretty shortly after that saying, basically, stop. So many of you are now heading to this museum. We're fine for volunteers. We've been absolutely inundated with responses. So I think it's clear that there is certainly an appetite to do something, to take some forms of action. And I think it was very heartening to me to see how many people wanted then to just rush to this museum on this holiday weekend to do their bit to go and document the exhibition.
What was his name, did you say?
This is Jim Millward, who's at Georgetown.
Oh, it's Jim Millward. Okay.
Oh, Jim. Oh.
Familiar to our China audience. Okay.
Oh, my God. Yes, we do know Jim.
It's telling of actually where we are in the current day here. it wasn't that you missed it. I actually omitted his name when I first mentioned it because I guess I was self-censoring in real time thinking, will I get him into trouble by mentioning this initiative? But he had said we could spread the word. So here we are, spreading the word.
If you're listening, Jim, we're going to spread the word. We'll put a link.
Well done, Jim.
Strength in numbers.
Goodness. Shifting towards the theme of journalism and journalistic reporting, you've been based in China and Russia, both very challenging environments for practicing journalism, especially today. And yet the US is also becoming quite hostile to journalists. How are you finding the practice of journalism changing under this administration in terms of your access, the everyday work of a journalist? Just any examples or thoughts on this would be very interesting.
I was always very clear in Russia and China that the people who are under the most threat were rarely the foreign journalists with passports from other countries and embassies that were going to inquire about their whereabouts. A lot of the worst pressure there was always on my Russian and Chinese colleagues, and in some cases, the direct threats to their families or to themselves. And I feel a little similarly about being a journalist now in the United States. There are a lot of people who are much more threatened and in a much more precarious position. That said, I think I have found myself very grateful to be working for a small British magazine, who, frankly, most people here have never heard of, that I have felt gives me more ability to go to, for instance, a lot of reporting from various Trump rallies in the run-up to the 2024 election. I would always lead in my introductions to people with, I'm from a British magazine, or I'm originally from the UK. I think I was deliberately trying to signal that I'm outside of the current debate here in the United States, that I'm not on a side. And I imagine if you're going into that scenario and introducing yourself as working for the New York Times or NPR, maybe the response to you is a little different. So I think that has given me a fair amount of freedom. It also, frankly, we're a small magazine, so I think we're not particularly in the sights of important people right now. Perhaps this podcast will turn that around. But, I'm conscious that there are colleagues at other publications that are just much more subject to daily pressures than I am.
Katie, on a related note, I've been quite shocked doing this podcast and one of my other roles as an editor at the Asia Society's China File website. I've been a little shocked by how quickly self-censorship has taken hold amongst quite a large group of scholars and academics at American universities. And we've sort of hinted at the subject of self-censorship already in our chat. I've already had several people, some at Ivy League universities, decline interviews or to comment on certain issues because they are worried about personal repercussions in their careers. And it really reminded me of China, of getting the answer like, 不方便, it's not convenient to talk about this.
Right, not convenient, yeah.
And have you encountered a lot of this, or has access to information gotten tighter?
Certainly around the 2024 election, talking to people at Paris events, I found a lot of people who didn't want me to use their name. That's the sort of thing I would expect to have been hearing in Russia or China. But even then, I think there was a clear sense of, I don't want to be the focus of attacks, and I'm concerned that there could be consequences to speaking out. I mean, it's pretty clear the way the White House press pool is being reconstituted currently. When you watch Trump do his remarks now, he's getting a lot of very softball question framed as sycophantic flattery of why his policies are so great. I think we're definitely losing something there when the number of people who can ask him genuine questions is being limited. I haven't had people tell me that same formulation yet, but I am aware that people are taking more risks now, and I think all sorts of people are making calculations about whether it could come back to bite them if they speak out and if they're seen to be a public voice that is at odds with the administration. So I think we're heading into pretty dangerous territory. And I mean, the two examples we've discussed of these particular historians who decided it was worth it still to speak out and to know themselves that they were doing the right thing and acting in accordance with their values. You can look at that and say that's courageous and inspiring. And you can look at that and say, knowing what might happen to me, would I make the same decision? And I think it's hard to say how many of us would be prepared to burn our own lives and careers down. It's very easy when there are no real consequences to this to talk about the importance of people speaking out and refusing to have self-censor and refusing to be silenced. But I think, unfortunately, we're learning now in real terms what those choices look like. And that's before things get worse. Again, I struggle with knowing how alarmed to be and whether this is just my prior experiences and my worst fears coloring this. But there is a real danger that we're heading now into territory where people just are much more reluctant to speak out. And that, unfortunately, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, if you don't see other people you admire and people who are in more powerful positions and people who are better able to withstand consequences, if you don't see institutions and individuals like that speaking out, I think that can have a chilling effect too on others who are looking for examples of how to act and how to respond in this moment.
And speaking of things getting worse, what are some of the most interesting stories in the US slide towards authoritarianism that you're observing, but maybe haven't had a chance to report yet?
Well, there's a story I've been thinking about doing for a little while, loosely titled, "Would Authoritarianism Really Be So Bad?" That looks at, I think, one of the things that you lose if you've always lived and worked in a democracy and you've always just assumed that you had the rule of law and recourse to independent courts, is I think there's maybe not enough sense of what is lost when you lose that. And I think it is worth looking at. There is support for ideas of having a strong leader who's going to shake things up and crime and deport anybody that you're not comfortable with. Like, there is support for those ideas. So I think it's important to look at what's behind that, what's driving that, and what are better answers to, again, if you want to put the best faith argument and say, a lot of support for Trump is driven by this sense that the country isn't working for people, that they've been left behind by globalization, that the economy isn't what they want it to be, it's important to have better answers to that question from a democratic standpoint. And it's also, the other thing to look at is this sense of, it's quite beguiling, this idea that these strongman leaders, you sort of see the imagery of Putin at his great big table giving orders, and this idea that those orders are carried out and they're running their countries with this strong hand. But as we all know, these systems are actually deeply dysfunctional. And as we saw from the latest cabinet meeting here in the United States, appointing people on the basis of loyalty rather than competence and surrounding yourself with sycophants and making it clear that you don't want to hear bad news reported up the line, that doesn't lead to great policy. That ends you up in positions like Putin believing that he's going to attack Ukraine and march into Kyiv in just a few days. I think some of these fantasies about strongman rule need to be debunked, and we should focus more on actually the pathologies of these systems and all the ways that they don't work and they don't lead to vibrant economies and great governance. Because I think we do just need to be realistic about, maybe it's not a majority support, but there is a degree of support in this country for Trump and the ideas that he's pushing.
And how do you think the rest of the world sees America? Are we totally hopeless when it comes to perceptions in Europe, for instance? Or are people seeing this Trumpian rule as a phase that will pass?
Speaking from a European perspective, at least, I think it's still somewhat the latter. There's still a sort of desire to believe that this is an aberration and things will go back to the way they were. I mean, I think you see it just even in the response to some of the latest developments on Ukraine, how quickly there is a desire in Europe to get behind the idea that, yes, Trump is definitely on board now with providing robust security guarantees to Ukraine. He's definitely losing patience with Putin. He's definitely moving more towards Ukraine's side. I think there is a desire to believe that this is going to get better and America is going to go back to the role that people have come to expect. But there is real damage being done. Also in Beijing, or actually in Tianjin earlier this week, we saw, for instance, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi holding hands with Putin and Xi at the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit. There was real damage being done in relationships with countries that are longstanding American allies and partners. And I think, after the first Trump term, you saw Joe Biden go on this tour, literally telling people America is back and pushing this idea that, that was a 4-year experiment with madness, but now we can get back to the status quo. I think that argument, if it's another president trying to make that argument in 2029, I think European leaders would have every reason to question to what extent they can trust that. So I think there is still a desire for things to go back to the way they were and for this not to be a permanent shift. But let's see where we are by the end of Trump's second term.
Which is still a long, long way away, which brings me to my final question for you, because Katie, you are one of these strange creatures who runs ultramarathons. So what can running an ultramarathon teach us about the long haul ahead for us in the United States?
Well, it possibly tells you that there is a straight read across between people who study authoritarian regimes and who enjoy punishing foot races.
There's a parallel going on.
The thing is that I guess the experience of ultra marathons is you're running on your own, but you have a lot of people helping you. So, I think one of the myths that is pushed in places and about places like Russia and China is the idea that these regimes are all powerful and that the images of goose-stepping groups in Tiananmen Square is the reality of these countries. And as we know, that is not the case, that there is such a diversity of opinion and views and individuals, even within these current strongman regimes. So I think that's the note of optimism for us here on our current ultramarathon into authoritarianism, is that part of the trick is making you think that it's hopeless, that you're the only one who feels that way, that you're the only one who's prepared to dissent or resist. But there are always like-minded people who are either foolish enough to also be running this type of marathon or who are supporting you and helping you to do it. So I guess that's as optimistic a note as I can find from this.
Well, I'm happy with that.
Nice conclusion.
I mean, I would at least recommend it as a distraction against, anybody that's feeling overwhelmed by current events. Running a really long way on a trail, maybe that's how we should all be spending our weekends, getting a little bit of respite.
That sounds like a good idea. Well, thank you so much, Katie, for this wonderful conversation. We learned so much from your insightful remarks. The Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by me, Maria Repnikova.
And me, Jeremy Goldkorn. The show is edited by Cadra Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed on the guzheng by Wu Fei. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed also by Wu Fei. And our cover art is by Li Yunfei.
Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, leave us a review, and if you like what we're doing, please take out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com.
Thank you so much, Katie.
Oh, thank you for having me.